Hey guys, welcome back to NWCS. In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to tackle resawing boards over here on your table saw. One of the most crucial steps to this is actually getting your vents and everything else dialed in perfectly. So your first thing you need to do is actually measure the center of your board, double check from both sides. You can use a marking gauge, you can use a square. In this case, I'm just using the tape measure. I'm going to mark what I think is center. Then I'm going to actually measure from the other side again to double check that it is centered. If it's not, then I'll make the adjustments back and forth until I get a perfect center. You can do the same thing with a marking gauge, but after you have the center kind of dialed in, the next thing you want to do is dial in your fence. What I'm going to do actually is just measure from the fence to, I believe, the center of the blade. I do plan to actually plane these down because I'm resawing them to glue them together to make panels for the door. Being that these are going to be resawn from the same board, I'm actually going to get a book match, so these panels are going to look really nice. One thing that I didn't really fully think about though is that I originally planned to make all my door panels out of 3/4 material, then glue them together and then plane them down. But the problem is, after going through the entire milling process and getting straight edges, all of my 3/4 boards are roughly 5.5 to 5.25 inches wide after, getting straight edges on them. And I need my panels to actually end up to be about 11.5, 11 5/8 to work with the dados that I'm going to cut into my door. So the way I had to do actually was use some of this leftover 6/4 material. Some of the 6/4 was actually about 6.5, 7 inches after the milling process. And the leftover 6/4 was originally for casing, but I had extra. So I figured if I resaw the 6/4 boards, I can actually get book matching. And I didn't have enough 6/4 material though to make enough to do all the panels. So I actually had a leftover 8/4 board that was about 4 foot long that can make up another panel. So I was planning to resaw the 6/4, resaw the one 8/4 that I had, add the 8/4 to the 3/4 that I have that's 5.5 inches, and then use the 6/4 book match to make 2 additional panels. It's a lot of jargon, but the one problem is resawing 6/4 material and planning to get 1/2 inch material at the end of it after a glue up is a little daunting because right now I have an 1/8 inch kerf, well, full kerf blade inside my table saw. So after getting everything centered up and then running this through the resawing process, I did everything I could to make sure my cut was perfectly straight and even. But again, it does leave room for error. So once you go through the glue up and trying to get this perfectly down to a 1/2 inch and flat, it's a little bit of a challenge, but we end up doing it. I do regret actually not making all this out of 8/4, but anyway, this is gonna be all right. But the first step to actually doing the resaw process like this is to take shallow passes. When you plan to resaw something over in the table saw, it actually is limited by the depth that your table saw can actually cut. In my case, I believe it's about 3.25, maybe 3.5 inches. So I know I can resaw boards up to 7 inches wide. So to get that done, the first thing I do is raise the blade up to maybe 1 inch and do 1 inch on each side. I flip the board end for end to keep the same face against the fence. That way I know my blade is still centered inside of the kerf. Doing shallow passes and slowly raising the blade after each one actually keeps heat from building up inside of the kerf, which keeps the blade from wobbling when you're actually going through the cut, which limits on blade marks and gives you a really phenomenal cut like you see here. And the book matching grain on this looks amazing. I love how it's like a little hourglass. The knots are actually mirrored on each side too, so it looks gorgeous. We're going to speed up a little bit and run through this one. I'm not going to slow it down this time, but it's essentially the same thing. By resawing the board, you get the grain actually mirrored on the other side. So these ones being 6/4 and actually resawing these, I do have a little bit of regret in it, but I do say that these 2 boards actually came out my favorite. A little bit more work to get them flat, but you guys will see that coming up once we get everything glued up and through the planer. And as you guys see here on the glue up, I think these came out of the table saw roughly 9/16, maybe 5/8. So like once we go through the glue up, I have to get these perfectly as flat as possible and as lined as possible, at least on one side. Because even with the resawing process, they didn't come out perfectly even. They're pretty close. I believe they're both about 9/16, maybe 5/8. But also because they're so thin, they also want to cup a little bit. So getting them perfectly flat and aligned during this glue up process keeps me from having to plane or turn most of this into sawdust. Which again, we're trying to aim at 1/2 inch, which will fit snugly inside of all of our dados. So the alignment process in this glue up here is extremely crucial. On the next glue up that we do, it's not as much because I'm actually using full 3/4 boards and the resawn 8/4, which I have plenty of material to plane away on that. But on these, I want to make sure that I'm as close as possible to keeping everything flat. So after spreading the glue on the joint, the one thing I want to do is actually make sure when I actually start applying the clamping pressure, to make sure that the boards are pressed firmly against the clamps when I start applying pressure. One thing that you guys might have saw in a previous video was me actually using shims to perfectly level off my workbench, because there's actually a slight dip here in the middle. And as you guys see here, I actually have the middle clamp shimmed up just enough to actually make sure it's making contact all the way across the boards by using a straight edge to make sure everything was, again, perfectly in line, because I want to be able to apply pressure on the boards as I apply the clamping pressure to make sure that the back side is perfectly flush. So when I start off with the planer, I'm not planing material off of both sides to get, you know, a flat surface. With these boards though, these are the ones that I actually resawn out of the 8/4 that I'm gluing to the other 3/4 boards that I already had. So again, I have plenty of material to plane off on this one. The other one is where the, you know, it was a little bit more crucial. But I didn't show it on the other one, but also I added cauls like I'm doing here. On the underside, I'm using a piece of AZAC that I know won't stick to the glue up. And in this case, the underside is what I'm really aiming to keep flat, because I know that these boards aren't the same thickness. But after getting a call on the underside, I think I do throw one on the top side on the other end, but it's not as crucial as putting the ones on the underside. And also the one on the underside needs to be AZAC, because that's where all the squeeze out from the glue up actually happens. After I have all my cauls applied, the last thing I want to do is actually throw some clamps on the top side of the board just to keep anything from cupping upwards. One of the worst things is when you're trying to do a panel glue up and you apply enough pressure on the underside and then everything bows upwards. That is a huge issue, especially if you plan to actually move the panel glue up from your tabletop and like rest it to the side. So adding these clamps on the top side kind of prevents that bowing up action, which again helps ensure that you have a nice and flat panel by the end of the process. One thing I can say about this though is actually when you apply your clamps, try to make sure when you do ones on the underside that you leave space in between them, so that way you can have even clamping pressure. Even though you're alternating your clamps from top to bottom, they're also spaced evenly across your board, because clamping pressure actually radiates out at like a 45-degree angle from each clamp. So clamping pressure and clamping placement actually is extremely crucial, but in this case not so much, because I have a large like 5-inch wide board between my actual glue line, so the clamping pressure is definitely radiating out enough to apply pressure all the way across my glue seam. But if you're doing something like a bunch of like 1-inch wide pieces and you're trying to glue them up, that's when you may want to add a clamping caul to the outside to allow your clamping pressure to radiate outward enough to actually cover your entire glue seam. My buddy Ian over at Eagle Works Co drew up a nice diagram to help me kind of understand it. It makes a lot of sense actually. I might have to draw one up just to show you guys here on the channel. It'll be a good info for you guys and a nice little chance of me trying to draw stuff on the marker board. We'll do that in another video. But if you guys have enjoyed this process, I hope you guys leave me a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.